Hi, welcome to our literature series sponsored by O3 Schools JAMB app. And our topic for today is genres of literature. Literature. This is the second part of this topic, and in the first part, we mentioned the three major genres of literature. We mentioned prose, poetry, and drama, and in that part, we also looked at prose. So today, we're going to be looking at poetry. Poetry is another major genre of literature, just like the prose that we've looked at and drama that we'll be looking into next after this. So let's look at poetry. What is poetry? Poetry is simply a form of literature or a type or a genre of literature that has to do with evoking emotions from the reader. Let's put that down. Is a type of literature that, let's say, aims to evoke emotions from the readers. It tries to appeal to the imaginations of the readers, tries to ignite their emotions. Poets do this by carefully choosing and arranging their words. They also have a range of poetic devices available to them. By poetic devices now, I mean figures of speech, rhyme, and other literary devices that we've looked at. You can check those videos. So they use these tools at their disposal to create a write-up that will evoke emotions from readers when they see it. Now, in the olden days, poetry existed, but it was in the form of songs, oral literature. So it was in the form of songs, and different songs were coined for different occasions. Now, poetry is more in the form of writing than songs. So we have more written poetry than oral. So let's look at the features or the elements of poetry. Features of poetry. The features that poetry contain. First up, we have stanza. Stanza. Poems are divided into stanzas. So a stanza is like a unit of poem. Let's say a combination of lines standing as a unit in a poem. We call it a stanza. Poems is made up of lines. So when a group of lines come together to stand on their own, we refer to it as a stanza. And we differentiate stanzas by using spacing. We space. Let's take Wole Soyinka's poem, for example, Abiku, written in vain, your bangles cast. The next line, charmed circles at my feet. I am Abiku, calling for the first and the repeated time. So this is the first stanza, and we see the spacing in between the lines. For us to begin the second stanza, you may now make sure to leave enough space that will differentiate these two stanzas. So the next one now will be, must I weep for goats and cowries, whatever. So you can see the space now, different from the ones in between the lines. So we differentiate stanzas with line spacing mostly. Ensure that the spacing between each stanza is bigger than the normal spacing between the lines. So that's stanzas for you. Stanzas are named according to the number of lines they contain. So, for example, from two lines, we call it a couplet, three lines, a tercet. Some contains four lines, a quatrain, like that, up till number of lines that we have, they have their names. Then also, it's not necessary for stanzas to contain rhymes. They can be rhymed, they can be unrhymed, they can have meter, they may choose not to have meter. But as long as a group of lines are standing on their own in a poem as a unit, we refer to it as a stanza. Up next, we have rhythm. Rhythm has to do with the syllables in a particular line. It's the pattern of emphasis on the syllables in a line. So we are dealing with the pattern of emphasis on the syllables in a line of a poem. We are dealing with rhythm. The pattern of emphasis. So for syllables, we can have stressed syllables and unstressed syllables. This is depicted with a stroke, and this is with an ox. So we can have stressed syllables, we can have unstressed syllables. So the pattern in which these syllables occur in a particular line of a poem, we refer to it as rhythm. And in poetry, there are five major rhythms that we have. That's the trochee, yam, spondy, spondy, dactyl, and anapest. So for reading, we're talking about the pattern of emphasis on the syllables. If you're confused about what syllables are, you can check the video that we have on syllables and stress. So reading is the pattern of emphasis on the syllables in a particular line. So for stanza now, we're dealing with a group of lines together, forming a unit. Or for reading individual lines, the pattern of emphasis that the syllables in this line contain, refer to it as rhythm. And the emphasis, we have stressed syllables, we have unstressed syllables. So in poetry, the five common or the major rhythm that we have the trochee, the yam, the spondy, dactyl, and anapest. For trochee, we have a stressed syllable coming before an unstressed syllable. So if this is the pattern of emphasis, stressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, refer to it as trochee. For yam, it's the opposite of trochee. So if we have an unstressed syllable coming before a stressed syllable, so when we have unstressed stress, unstressed stress, unstressed stress in that pattern, refer to it as am. For spondy, they have equal emphasis. So either mostly stressed syllables. So you have stressed syllable coming after a stressed syllable. So for dactyl, we have an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable and another stressed syllable before the unstressed again. So when you have like rhythm now, the first syllable is unstressed, the next is stressed, the next is also stressed. Before you come in contact with another unstressed syllable, then two stressed syllables. That's the dactyl for you. Then anapest is still the opposite of dactyl, which means two unstressed syllables, then a stressed syllable. Two unstressed syllables followed by a stressed syllable. This is the most common reading that we find in poetry these days. So don't forget the pattern of emphasis. Emphasis, we have stressed and unstressed. It's either the syllable is stressed or the syllable is unstressed. So depending on how these are arranged, that's what I mean by pattern. We are now dealing with rhythm. The pattern of emphasis on syllables in a poem. Next, we have meter. Meter. Meter is similar to the rhythm, but while rhythm just dwells on the pattern of emphasis alone, meter also has to do with the number of syllables. So it is the number of syllables. Let's read this. It is the number of syllables in a line of poem and the pattern of emphasis on the syllables. So rhythm has to do with just the pattern of emphasis. But for meter, we're talking about the number of syllables as well as the pattern. So for number, you can have monometer or dimeter, tri, what have you. So if you're not dealing with the meter in a poem, you can now have maybe the most common one we have iambic pentameter. So this has to do with the pattern of emphasis. This has to do with the number of syllables in that line. For rhythm and meter, we're talking about the lines individually. So we have iambic pentameter. This means five. So five groups of syllables that follow this pattern. So we have unstressed stress syllable, unstressed stress, unstressed stress five times. That's iambic pentameter. So though the rhythm and the meter are similar, they are not exactly the same. Next we have rhyme. This is easy. Even have there's a video on rhyme, you can check that out, the whole video. But rhyme is simply the repetition of sound at the end of words. So rhyme is simply the repetition of sound at the end of words. Rhyme, sorry, is more about sound than spellings. So it doesn't matter if they are spelled differently. What matters is the sound. What sound can you get from those words? So by the time we have the same sound being repeated in words, we refer to it as rhyme. And it's very, very common in poetry. It's pleasing to the ears, it aids us in remembering better, it aids our memory. The rhyme helps us remember better. So maybe because of that, poets like to really introduce it. It's not compulsory. Not all poems must have rhyme, but based on obvious advantages, most poets like to include rhyme in their poems. Then for lines, we now have rhyme scheme. Ordered pattern of lines at the end of poetic lines. So by the time we repeat rhymes at the end of lines, we refer to it as rhyme scheme. We have different schemes. You can have the A B A B, A B C B, depending on the choice of the poet. So for the A B A B, it means line 1, line 3, the rhyme, line 2, line 4, rhyme. For this one, we mean line 2 and line 4 contain rhymes. So there are many rhyming schemes at the disposal of poets. Next, we have enjambment. Enjambment, unlike in prose where we write in sentences and paragraphs, like writers can just keep writing until they are like they've exhausted the message they're trying to pass across. In poetry, we write in lines. So sometimes a line might not fully express the poet's thought, and then he will continue in the next line. We refer to it as enjambment or run on line. It's also called run on line with the hyphens, run on line. I would say it occurs when a thought is spread over lines. The poet couldn't complete it in the first line, so he spills over to the next line to continue. Let's still use Wole Soyinka's Abiku as an example. The first line says, "In vain your bangles cast." This sentence is not complete. Whatever the poet is trying to pass across, you can't get it just from here. The bangles cast what? So Wole Soyinka goes to the next line to explain charm circles around my feet. So this is an example of enjambment. On its own, this first line is not really expressing anything. You cannot really fully get where the poet is going to or what the poet is talking about. So he decides to go to the next line to complete the sentence. Because if you have to read out these two, it will make perfect sense. In vain, your bangles cast charm circles around my feet. But the poet decided to spread the thought over two lines. So we refer to it as enjambment. Poets use it a lot. Next, we have theme. It's the central idea. The main idea that the work is talking about. And in this case, we are dealing with poetry. So whatever the poem is talking about, refer to it as theme. Much like even prose has theme, poetry also has theme. Most common themes for poets, we have love, beauty, nature. These are common examples of themes that most poems are about. Most poems are about these very common things. Although these are not all, you can have other things that poets can write on. So these features, that's the stanza, the rhyme, reading, meter, and enjambments that we've looked at, they are majorly found in poetry, majorly found in poems. That doesn't mean that these are all the features or these are all poetry entities. Poetry can also contain figures of speech, which we've looked at. You can check out the videos on figures of speech, contains syntax, arrangement of words, to diction too. Poets also have to note their word choice, tone, mood, as well as other literary devices that we've also looked at. They are also features of poetry, but these are the major ones. So let's now look at the types of poems. There are different kinds of poems with distinct characteristics and features. Let's look at the common ones that we have. First off, we have lyric or lyrical poem. Lyrical poems are simply poems that can be sung. Lyrical poems. That we can sing them. Poems that can be sung, we refer to them as lyrical poems, and they mostly contain rhyme and they are often emotional. But as long as there's this musical quality to them and you can turn them into songs, we refer to them as lyrical poems. Next, we have sonnet. A sonnet is a poem with 14 lines. A poem containing 14 lines, we refer to it as a sonnet. When we say 14 lines, we don't mean like all 14 lines form a stanza. No, it can be broken down into stanzas of maybe 4, 4, 6. As long as the total number of lines in that poem is 14, we refer to it as a sonnet. And then there are two types of sonnet. We have the English sonnet and Italian sonnet. Major difference between these two types is in the rhyming scheme. The English sonnet has a different rhyming scheme than So the Italian sonnet. Next we have ode. And an ode is a lyrical poem meant to express intense feelings. Feelings such as, let's say, love, respect, or praise. Just meant to express intense feelings. It could be for a person, it could be for an object, but as long as it's meant to express like deep feelings for the person or the object, we refer to it as an ode. And it's a lyrical poem, which means it could be sung. We have elegy, sometimes called dirge, although there are slight differences because dirge is more a song, while elegy is a poem, but they are similar. And this is a poem to mourn the dead. The dead. So it's a poem that expresses grief, sadness, sorrow over the loss of someone. It could be someone close to you or a hero that you admire so much. Although the effect is more potent when it is an immediate loss that you can easily feel the person's sadness if it is the loss of a close relative. So a poem written to mourn the dead is an elegy, which is not the same as eulogy. Eulogy is a speech, although they say it at funerals to like honor the deceased. It's not the same thing as elegy. Let's not confuse the two, even though the spellings are similar. Next, we have ballad. Ballads are poems that tell stories. A poem that tells a story. You're trying to tell a story in form of a poem. You're writing a ballad. This is like one of the oldest forms of poetry that we have. And they are mostly, not always, it's not a rule, but they are mostly written in 4 line stanzas. Stanzas of 4 lines. Are written mostly, or you can say quatrain. That's the name for stanzas that contain 4 lines. So most ballads contain that, but it is not a rule. It's definitely not a must that if you're writing a ballad, it must contain 4 lines in a stanza. Next, we have panegyric, and it's a poem that expresses high praise. So the poet uses hyperbole mostly as exaggeration to like glorify or honor the qualities of maybe a person or an object, whatever other poem is praising. Next, we have an epic or epic poem. These ones are stories, poems about heroes. Epic poem is a lengthy poem, usually about extraordinary deeds, extraordinary feats carried out by heroes in the past. So it's usually about things that have been done in the past, not just things, extraordinary things to like project the heroes and their heroic deeds. So poems like that, we refer to them as epic or epic poem. So poems that express or poems that tell us about the heroic deeds carried out by heroes in the past, we refer to them as epic poems. We have blank verse. A blank verse is a poem that contains meter. Sorry. It contains meter, but it doesn't contain rhyme. And the meter is usually the iambic pentameter. We explain this when we're looking at features of poetry. So usually the iambic pentameter, although it's not compulsorily that, but most times it contains meter, but it doesn't contain rhyme. And then we have free verse. This contains neither meter nor rhyme. So while the blank verse has just meter but no rhyme, the free verse doesn't contain meter, it does not contain rhyme. So the difference between this is that this one, although it doesn't have rhyme, it still has rhythm because of the meter. This one has no meter, has no rhythm, has no rhyme. That's free verse. But if it has meter, it will call it a blank verse. And then there's parody. It's a type of poem that imitates other poems but to mock them, but with mockery. We call it a parody. So a type of poem that imitates other kinds of poems, mostly epic poems, usually epic poems, but the intent is to mock. So poets use like deliberate over exaggeration to like bring out the effect of this mockery. And for us to really know parody, you should be familiar with the source. Like which poem is this poet trying to imitate? Then you'll be able to get it, be able to appreciate that poem as a parody when you know the source. So this is where we'll stop for poetry. We've defined poetry, mentioned the features of or elements that poetry contain, and then we've looked at the common types of poetry. In our next class, we'll be looking at drama.